In 1987, a little boy vanished without a trace from his home in suburban Oregon. No ransom note, no forced entry, no goodbye, just a quiet morning, and then silence. For 25 years, his name was whispered through cold case files and broken memories, until one day, his sister returned to the house they had grown up in and found something buried beneath the basement floor. What she uncovered wasn't just the key to his disappearance. It was a truth so dark, so devastating, it had been cemented in silence for a generation. This is not a tale about monsters in the dark. It's about the ones we eat dinner with, the ones we trust, the ones who wear love like a mask. This is the story of a boy who was never October 15th, 1987, began like any other autumn morning in the quiet neighborhood of Selwood, a leafy, slow-beating heart nestled in the southern reaches of Portland, Oregon. The maples were turning amber. The sidewalks were littered with leaves that danced in the crisp breeze. And in the modest two-story home on Lambert Street, the Herrera family was stirring into their daily rhythm, unaware that within minutes their world would collapse into a silence that would echo for 25 years. Michael Herrera was 8 years old, small for his age, with tousled dark hair, eyes full of curiosity, and a mind always racing toward the next question. That week, his excitement had been bubbling over. His third-grade science teacher had assigned a project: observe and document an animal in its natural habitat. While most of his classmates chose ants or fish, Michael had set his sights higher. "I want to study a frog," he declared at dinner 2 nights earlier, "a real one, with bumpy skin and long legs." His mother, Carla, had laughed softly, brushing his hair from his face. "Only if you promise not to put it in your sister's shoe like last time." This morning, Carla was already at the stove when Michael bounded into the kitchen, still pulling on his blue windbreaker over the navy uniform of Lincoln Elementary. "Mom, can we go to the wetlands this weekend? That's where the frogs are, right?" "We'll see, mi amor," she replied gently, handing him a plate with half-toasted English muffins, smeared with beans and cheddar. "First, let's get through today." Patricia, his 16-year-old sister, called down from the stairs. "Michael, don't leave without me. I'll walk you to the corner." She was always the responsible one. She'd taken on more than a teenager should, especially since their father had started spending long hours in the basement workshop. She was already late, rummaging through her backpack for a missing assignment. But Michael didn't wait. He never did. He slipped his backpack on, grabbed his breakfast with one hand, and shouted, "Love you, Mom," before darting out the front door. The screen door creaked, then slammed shut. Carla barely had time to wipe her hands and glance up before he was gone, swallowed by the golden light streaming between the houses. 7 minutes later, Patricia jogged down the porch steps, still chewing on a pen cap, eyes scanning the street. No sign of Michael. She frowned. Normally he waited for her at the corner of SC 13th and Spokane Street, but not today. She assumed he'd simply gone ahead. He hated being late. He's probably already halfway to school, she thought, adjusting her bag and walking briskly in the opposite direction toward her high school. At 8:05 a.m., the third-grade roll call began at Lincoln Elementary. "Michael Herrera?" asked Miss Thompson. Silence. "Anyone seen Michael today?" A few kids shrugged. One mumbled, "He wasn't at the flagpole." Miss Thompson made a small mark beside his name and moved on. At 2:45 p.m., when the final bell rang and students poured out like autumn leaves fluttering from trees, Michael wasn't among them. At 3:12 p.m., Carla stood at the front window, her apron still on, her eyes scanning the sidewalk. At 3:30 p.m., she called the school. Her heart skipped a beat when the receptionist said, "He didn't attend today." By 4 p.m., Carla was knocking on doors, neighbors, friends, even the bus stop monitor. At 6:10 p.m., Robert Herrera returned from work and found his wife pale, frantic, surrounded by worried faces and unanswered questions. "Michael's missing," Carla said, with a voice that was barely a whisper. Robert didn't ask what she meant. He didn't waste a second. He grabbed his flashlight and was out the door again within minutes, combing through alleyways, garages, and backyard sheds. That night, the Herrera home remained dark. That night, Patricia sat in her room, shaking, replaying the moment she called down to Michael, the moment she was too late by 5 minutes. That night, the last traces of warmth in the Portland fall faded into a coldness no season could explain. And across town, a flyer machine at a 24-hour print shop began to spit out the first of hundreds of posters that would blanket the city for years to come. Missing Michael Herrera, age 8, Last seen October 15th, 1987. Blue windbreaker, navy school uniform, brown eyes. If seen, please call. But no one would call. Not that day. Not that year. Not for the next 20-5.LE lost. Just hidden. And the woman who refused to let him be forgotten. At the corner of SC 13th and Spokane Street, the intersection where Michael was supposed to wait for his sister, time seemed to pause that morning. Just briefly. Just enough for something irreversible to happen. The corner itself wasn't remarkable. A crosswalk, a lamppost with old flyers peeling off, a wooden bench, and a small maple tree losing its red-orange leaves like embers. It was a quiet corner, the kind where kids passed every day, where nothing ever happened, until it did. Witnesses came forward in the following hours, reluctantly at first, and then with growing concern as the reality set in. The boy really hadn't come home. Mrs. Nolan, the elderly widow who always sat in her window knitting, told Carla she'd seen Michael that morning, standing by the lamppost, backpack slung awkwardly over one shoulder, clutching something in his hand, maybe a book or a snack. He looked like he was waiting, she said, not rushing to school like he usually does. He kept looking down the street, like someone was late. Then came Mr. Anders, who ran the gas station nearby. He remembered waving at Michael around 8:10 a.m. He didn't wave back, he said, which was strange. That kid always waved. Polite little guy. A teenage boy at the bus stop said he saw a man standing nearby, tall, in a dark overcoat, talking to Michael. They weren't yelling or anything, the boy said. It looked like they knew each other. But when asked if he saw the man's face, he shook his head. He had his back to me, just tall, gray hair, like a grandpa, but not the friendly kind. That single detail, the man in the coat, ignited a flurry of speculation that spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Was he a stranger? A relative? A family friend? Carla and Robert racked their memories, but could think of no one matching that description. Patricia, tormented by guilt, asked herself over and over, what if she hadn't been 5 minutes late? Would Michael have waited for her? Would he still be here? The next day, the local news station aired a brief segment on the disappearance. A picture of Michael, his school portrait with an awkward smile, crooked teeth and all, flashed on screen beside the words, "Missing since October 15th. Viewers called in tips, most of them dead ends. A boy on a bike in Hillsborough, a kid wandering near Gresham. Nothing panned out, but one call stood out. An older man named Clay Jefferson called from an auto parts store 6 blocks away. I saw the boy, he said. I remember because I almost tripped over him. He claimed Michael had been sitting on the curb around 8:25, staring at a piece of paper. Then a black sedan pulled up, he added. That's the last I saw. The description matched nothing the Herreras owned. Robert didn't drive a sedan. Carla didn't even own a license. The police followed up, but without plates or more specifics, there was little they could do. No surveillance cameras, no cell phones, no GPS. Just memories already fraying at the edges. Days passed, then weeks. Posters began curling at the corners, soaked by Portland's October rains. The once buzzing neighborhood settled into a strange silence. Parents no longer let their children walk alone. Teachers stopped smiling in the mornings. Halloween decorations were taken down early. And still, every morning, Carla walked the same route Michael should have taken. Past the cracked sidewalk, under the maple tree, stopping at the corner where he had last been seen. She looked left, then right, then up at the gray sky as if it could give her back her son. Robert, who had always been stoic, became quieter. He spent more hours in the basement, fixing old radios and appliances that nobody had asked him to fix. Patricia tried to resume school, but she couldn't focus. Every time she passed the hallway bulletin board where missing kids' photos were pinned, her breath caught. He was supposed to be with me, she whispered to herself each night before sleep, as though saying it enough times might rewind time. James, the middle child, stopped talking altogether. He clutched Michael's toy robot for days, refusing to let it go, and refused to go near the corner of 13th and Spokane. He said the sidewalk there felt cold. Investigators kept circling back to that intersection. Someone had to see something, they insisted, but nobody did. Or, if they did, they didn't understand what they were witnessing. Maybe it was just a handshake. Maybe a gentle tug on the backpack. Maybe a whisper. But in those few minutes, between 8:10 and 8:30 a.m., Michael disappeared from the world. No sound, no struggle, just gone. One theory emerged that made Carla shiver, that Michael had known the man. That's why there was no scream, no running, no resistance, only trust. If true, it was worse than any kidnapping by a stranger. It meant betrayal, from someone close, someone who walked among them. Robert dismissed it. He wouldn't go with just anyone, he said. Not Michael, but Patricia wasn't so sure. He would, she thought to herself, if he thought they were safe, if they were family. That unspoken fear lingered like smoke in the walls. The corner became a ghost of itself. And in the silence that followed, the whole neighborhood began to forget how bright Michael's voice had been, how quickly he used to laugh, how often he made up stories about becoming a scientist or explorer. But his family didn't forget. Not the corner, not the 7 minutes, and certainly not the boy who vanished into nothing. The house on Lambert Street was never meant to hold silence. Yet, after Michael disappeared, that was all it seemed to do. It didn't creak with laughter anymore, didn't hum with clattering dishes or the muffled sound of cartoons on weekend mornings. Instead, it echoed every little noise, the ticking of the old clock in the hallway, the mechanical whir of the refrigerator, the slow exhale of wind against the windows, as though the walls themselves were grieving. Patricia felt it first. She used to come home and find her little brother sprawled on the floor, coloring the sidewalk chalkbook they shared, or building makeshift forts out of couch cushions. Now, she stepped into a house where every room felt like it was waiting for someone who never arrived. The worst was the dining room. Michael's place at the table remained untouched for days, then weeks. Carla kept setting his plate out, quietly, stubbornly, as if the ritual alone might bring him back. Eventually, Robert asked her to stop. She didn't argue. She just nodded and set the plate anyway the next night. Robert, once the steady pillar of the family, began spending more and more time in the basement workshop. He said it was for repairs, for side jobs, but Patricia noticed he rarely brought any tools back upstairs. Instead, he came up with red eyes and hands that trembled slightly when he poured himself coffee. He was unraveling slowly from the inside out. He didn't talk about it, not to Carla, not to the kids, not even to the detectives when they made their rounds every few weeks. "I've said everything I know," he'd mutter. And maybe he had, but there was something hollow behind his words, a hesitancy Patricia didn't understand back then. Carla retreated into a loop of rituals, lighting candles, praying by the front window, calling Michael's name under her breath when she folded laundry. She grew thin. Her voice turned quieter, softer, like she was afraid of disturbing a world that had already taken too much. She stopped baking. She stopped singing while cleaning. She stopped being Carla. James, who had shared a room with Michael, simply stopped speaking for a while. He'd lie in bed, clutching one of Michael's old t-shirts, and stare at the ceiling for hours. Once, Patricia found him trying to fold all of Michael's clothes back into the drawers so he doesn't get cold, he whispered. When she tried to hug him, he didn't move. Friends stopped visiting. Neighbors brought over casseroles and words like hope and miracles, but none of it filled the void. The living room couch remained untouched. The TV stayed off. School notices piled up on the kitchen counter, unopened. No one had the energy to care about book fairs or PTA meetings or overdue library books. Even the family dog, a terrier mix named Lenny, began sleeping in Michael's closet, refusing to be coaxed out. Patricia stopped attending her after-school clubs. She stopped playing piano. She walked the same sidewalk Michael used to take every morning, hoping irrationally that her legs might trace his steps backwards and undo whatever had gone wrong. She asked her parents questions they didn't want to answer. "Do you think someone took him? What if he got lost and can't find his way back? What if he's still here, just somewhere we're not looking?" Robert snapped once. "We've looked, everywhere. He's not here, Patricia." But she saw the pain behind his anger. He was a man drowning in guilt, not because he knew something, she thought, but because he didn't, or couldn't. The police, overwhelmed with other cases and limited resources, began to shift their attention. The detective assigned to the case, Samuel Price, was a kind-eyed man who clearly cared, but even he grew weary. "We're doing everything we can," he'd tell Carla, "but we need more to go on. Someone has to come forward." But no one ever did. There were no ransom notes, no strange phone calls, no sightings credible enough to chase. Just silence. Heavy, endless silence. And within that silence, the Herrera family began to crumble. Their once lively dinners turned into quick, quiet meals eaten separately. Robert would come home late, eat alone, then descend into the basement for hours. Carla stopped eating with the family altogether. James drifted. Patricia held on. Just barely. She filled notebooks with drawings of her brother, what he might look like now, where he might be. She wrote imaginary letters from him, addressed to "my big sister," as if she could summon him through words. Sometimes she dreamed of him knocking on the door, wet from the rain, older, but still grinning, still Michael. And then she'd wake to the crushing weight of reality and the sound of the house. Too quiet, too empty, too cold. The seasons changed, leaves fell again. The anniversary of his disappearance passed like a ghost through their home, leaving behind candles and unsaid things. On the mantel, Carla placed a framed photo of Michael in his school uniform next to a small ceramic frog he had once painted. "He was going to be a scientist," she said softly one evening. Robert looked away. No one corrected her. No one said was. The house no longer echoed with possibility. It had become a place of waiting, a place where time didn't move forward, a tomb disguised as a home. And yet, they stayed. Because to leave would be to give up the only place he might still return to. Because even in its silence, the house still held his ghost, his scent on a pillow, his laughter, faint and fading in the walls, his shoes by the door, unmoved. Patricia knew deep down that something was wrong, not just with the world, but with their home, with the story, with how everything had unfolded. And though she couldn't explain it yet, she would one day return to this house, not just as a daughter, but as the one who would pull the truth from its foundations, brick by buried brick. But for now, the house stayed quiet, waiting. Just like them. In the months that followed Michael's disappearance, the absence of answers created something almost more dangerous than certainty: speculation. Like smoke creeping under locked doors, theories began to fill every corner of the neighborhood, seeping into conversations over fences, whispered exchanges at the grocery store, and murmured prayers after Sunday Mass. The Herrera family became more than just neighbors. They became a mystery. Some people, well-meaning but ignorant, said Michael had probably run away. "Kids do that," they muttered. "He'll come back when he's hungry." Others whispered darker things. "What if someone took him?" they asked in hushed tones. "What if he never even made it to the schoolyard?" In classrooms, kids started repeating versions of what they'd overheard at home. Patricia, who used to walk through her high school halls with a quiet confidence, now felt stares burning into her back. "That's the girl whose brother vanished," someone whispered behind her locker one morning. Even James, just 12 at the time, wasn't spared. A classmate told him that maybe Michael had been snatched by a creepy guy in a black van and buried in the woods. James didn't reply. He just went home and cried into the sleeve of Michael's old sweatshirt. But the worst theories weren't the ones whispered by strangers. They were the ones that grew inside the house itself, unspoken but impossible to ignore. Carla, for all her praying and hoping, began to wonder if someone close had done something. "It doesn't make sense," she told Patricia one evening as they folded laundry in silence. No trace, no sign, like he vanished into the air. Robert didn't speak during these conversations. He just stared at the floor, rubbing the back of his neck, eyes hollow. When Detective Samuel Price came by with his partner in December, he brought more files, more papers, and more frustration. "We've followed every lead," he told the family in the living room, the Christmas tree behind him still undecorated. "We've checked known offenders, talked to every person on the street, even pulled school attendants and bus routes. But there's nothing." Carla stared at him with eyes like cracked glass. "So you're saying he's just gone?" Price sighed. "I'm saying we need someone to talk. Someone must have seen something they didn't think was important." And just like that, the air shifted. Attention turned inward. The idea that someone might be holding a secret, that someone might be lying, or worse, protecting someone, began to sink its teeth in. Patricia noticed how her mother started locking her bedroom door at night, how Robert's trips to the basement became longer and more frequent, how James, once her shadow, now avoided everyone, including her. The community, once so tightly knit, began to fray. Doors stayed closed. Porch lights flicked on early. Rumors spread about a drifter seen near the school that week, about a former janitor who'd been fired the year before for being too friendly, about a neighbor who moved away just 2 months later and refused to speak to police. None of it led anywhere, but each new whisper fed the myth of Michael Herrera, the boy who disappeared from the corner of SE 13th in Spokane without a trace, the boy who walked into a fog and never came back. And the longer the silence stretched, the more desperate the explanations became. One woman told Carla she thought Michael had been taken by a cult. Another claimed to have seen him in a dream, barefoot and crying near a lake. Carla listened to all of it, holding on to hope like a rope fraying in her fingers. Robert, on the other hand, became even colder. "It's garbage," he'd mutter. "People love playing detective when it's not their kid." But even his anger had cracks. One night, Patricia found him staring at the missing poster they'd taped to the fridge. He didn't notice her in the doorway. He whispered, almost inaudibly, "I'm sorry." She didn't know what he meant. Not yet. The official investigation slowed after 6 months. The leads dried up. Media coverage dwindled. Detective Price, loyal but tired, still checked in monthly, but his tone changed. "We'll keep the file open," he said, "but you need to prepare yourselves." Carla shook her head. "My son is alive." Price offered a tight smile. "Then we'll keep looking." But Patricia knew what was really happening. The case was becoming cold, frozen, like the rain-slicked sidewalks outside. Still, every night, Carla lit a candle by the front window. Still, every Sunday, she put Michael's name in the prayer request at church. Still, Patricia drew his face over and over in the margins of her school notebooks. But even hope has limits. In 1992, 5 years after the disappearance, a woman from Seattle called the hotline, claiming she'd seen a boy matching Michael's description at a gas station near Tacoma. Robert drove there that night. It wasn't him. In 1995, they got a letter in the mail, no return address, containing only 3 words: "He's not gone." It turned out to be a cruel hoax. By the end of the decade, Carla had joined a support group for parents of missing children. There, she met other mothers who lived in the same awful space between memory and reality. One woman told her something that stuck with Patricia for years. "It's not the death that kills you. It's not knowing if they ever died." Patricia began journaling, writing her own versions of what might have happened, creating endings, some hopeful, some tragic, just to give her mind a place to rest. But none of her theories felt right. None of them explained the lack of evidence, the stillness, the quiet, the way time didn't move forward in their house. One evening in 2001, Carla said something that made Patricia's skin crawl. "Sometimes I wonder, what if he never left the property?" Patricia looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" Carla's eyes were distant. "I don't know, just mothers know things, Patricia. We feel things." Patricia laughed it off then. But years later, she would remember that night, the way the candle flickered, the way the air seemed to stop, the way her mother's voice trembled. Not with fear, but with something far worse. Knowing. Time, people said, would heal the wound, but they didn't understand that some wounds don't close. They just sink deeper, calcify under the skin, become part of the bone. The Herrera family didn't heal. They learned to breathe around the ache, to live inside the silence that had settled over the house like dust. Days turned to months, then years, and though the pain dulled, it never disappeared. It only adapted, weaving itself into every glance, every dinner table silence, every unopened birthday card Carla kept in the kitchen drawer marked Michael. Patricia finished high school and started working for the city clerk's office, but she never truly left home. Not in her mind, not in her heart. She got married in 1998 to Fernando Valdez, a kind, quiet man who had once been her lab partner in government tech school. Their wedding was small, just close friends and family, but Michael's absence loomed over the ceremony like a shadow that refused to step aside. Robert walked her down the aisle with stiff steps and watery eyes, squeezing her arm just a little too tightly, and though no one said it out loud, everyone felt the same thing. There should have been more laughter, more chairs filled, one more tuxedoed boy fidgeting beside the altar. Patricia's husband was gentle with her grief. He never asked too many questions about Michael, only held her when she woke up from nightmares or when she stared too long at old photos. James married a few years later and named his firstborn son Michael Angel, a silent tribute no one questioned. His daughter came a year later. Her name was Hope. James moved to the suburbs of Eugene to work in construction, and though the family still visited during holidays, he never again stayed the night in the house on Lambert Street. "It's too quiet," he said once. offering no further explanation. Robert and Carla remained in the home, stubbornly preserving it like a museum. Michael's room was left untouched, his bed neatly made, his bookshelf still arranged by topic, his sneakers lined perfectly against the wall, toes pointed toward the door like they were still waiting for him to slip them on. Carla dusted it weekly, sometimes sitting on the edge of the bed and talking to the air, murmuring updates about birthdays and new recipes and James's kids. She still placed a cupcake on the windowsill every October 15th. She still lit a candle every night. Robert, now in his late 50s, developed arthritis in his hands, but continued to spend long hours in the basement workshop, tinkering with old radios and microwaves, fixing things no one had asked him to fix. Patricia, who had moved with Fernando into a small apartment across town, began to visit more often after her mother's health began to decline. Carla's body was aging faster than her years, and the doctors attributed it to stress-related inflammation, an unsurprising diagnosis for someone who had lived a quarter-century in suspended grief. In 2005, Carla suffered a mild heart attack. Though she survived, her mobility diminished, and Patricia made the decision to move back into her childhood home to help care for her parents. Fernando, ever patient, agreed without hesitation. "This is your family," he said, "and mine now too." Moving back into the house felt like entering a dream Patricia had spent years trying to forget. Everything looked the same wallpaper in the hallway, the same dent in the stair rail, the same creaky floorboard outside the bathroom door. But something was different now. The house felt tired, as if it had carried its grief so long that it had begun to bend under the weight. Some windows wouldn't close fully. The basement smelled mustier than ever, and the air, especially in Michael's room in the basement, felt thick, dense, like the house was holding its breath. In early 2012, during a particularly damp Portland winter, Patricia began pushing for a full renovation of the house, not just to make it livable, but to breathe life back into it. "The foundation needs work," she told Robert one evening as they sat in the kitchen. "The walls downstairs are starting to mold. If we don't fix it now, we'll lose the whole house." Robert nodded reluctantly. His body was slower now, his voice quieter, but he still spent most evenings in the basement, surrounded by the buzz of old machines and the scent of solder. Carla, now dependent on oxygen assistance during cold months, finally agreed. The house was no longer just a memory. It had become a burden. Fernando reached out to a contractor friend named Sebastian Morales, a structural engineer with experience in restoring older homes. After a brief inspection, Sebastian recommended starting in the basement. "There's water damage in the north wall," he explained. "We'll need to excavate a bit, install new drainage, maybe reinforce the foundation. It's nothing too serious yet, but we can't ignore it much longer." The work was scheduled for mid-March, and Patricia didn't think twice about the chosen date, March 15th. She was focused on logistics, budget, timelines, moving furniture. It wasn't until much later that she realized the cruel symmetry of the calendar, 24 years and 5 months to the day since her brother vanished. On the morning the crew arrived, Robert stood at the bottom of the stairs, arms crossed, watching them dismantle his workshop. His eyes moved slowly over each tool, each shelf, as if saying goodbye. "It'll look better than ever when it's done," Patricia said, trying to sound cheerful. Robert didn't answer. He just nodded once and turned back toward the furnace. Upstairs, Carla sat in her recliner, humming a hymn under her breath, unaware that the ground beneath her feet was about to whisper a secret it had kept for nearly a generation. And Patricia, though focused on permits and paint samples and ventilation upgrades, felt something uneasy crawling up her spine as she glanced at the floor and whispered to herself, "Let this be a new beginning." But some beginnings, she was about to learn, come only after endings, and some endings are buried in concrete dot. It was on the third day of renovations, just after 10 a.m., when everything changed. The workers had been digging along the north wall of the basement, exactly where the engineer had identified the moisture damage. At first, it was just dirt and old concrete, brittle with time, flaking under the shovels. Then Gustavo Hernandez, one of the crew, paused, his shovel striking something solid that didn't sound like stone or pipe. A dull metallic clink echoed softly through the basement. He bent down, brushed away a thin layer of earth, and uncovered a corner of what appeared to be a metal box. "Hey, boss," he called out. "There's something weird down here." Sebastian Morales came over, crouched beside him, and dug gently with gloved hands until the box was fully revealed. It was rectangular, roughly the size of a shoebox, wrapped in black plastic, now torn and dirt-stained. Its corners rusted and edges worn, but intact. Patricia, who had been upstairs organizing lunch for the crew, heard the commotion and came down. The moment her eyes landed on the box, something in her stomach flipped, a deep, visceral twist that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with instinct. "What is that?" she asked, though her voice barely rose above a whisper. Sebastian looked at her and shrugged. "Could be anything. People bury stuff sometimes. Tools, money, old photos. Could be junk." But Patricia wasn't convinced. There was something unsettling about the way the box was placed, tucked neatly near the wall, exactly where her father's workbench had stood for decades. Not randomly dropped, deliberately hidden. "Don't open it," she said quickly, a strange urgency rising in her chest. "Not here. Not yet." She went back upstairs and called Fernando. "They found a box," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "In the basement. I don't know what it is, but it doesn't feel right." Fernando, who knew the tone in his wife's voice better than anyone, left work and arrived 30 minutes later. By then, the workers had stopped for lunch. Patricia and Fernando carried the box, still wrapped in remnants of black plastic, into the backyard, placing it on the old picnic table beneath the canopy of an aging oak tree. The air was cool, but Patricia's palms were sweating. Fernando retrieved a wrench from the shed and slowly pried open the corroded latch. It creaked with resistance, and when the box finally gave way, they both recoiled, not from what was inside, but from what it meant. The contents were mundane on the surface. A folded navy blue child's windbreaker, a composition notebook with a bent cover, a pair of worn sneakers, and a photograph. But Patricia's breath caught when she saw the final item. A small Mickey Mouse wristwatch, the one Michael had received for his birthday 3 months before he vanished. It was unmistakable. The plastic strap, once vibrant, was now dulled by age, the clock hands frozen at 8:47. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up, the weight of it far heavier than it should have been. "It's his," she whispered. "It's Michael's." She didn't cry. Not yet. Her body was too busy absorbing the shock, her mind spinning through every memory, every corner of the house, every theory that had come and gone like autumn fog. Fernando carefully unfolded the notebook. Inside, written in Michael's uneven scrawl, was his name, Michael Herrera, grade 3. The pages were mostly blank, but in the back he had drawn something, a simple sketch of a frog, wide-eyed and smiling, labeled "My Science Project." Patricia stared at it, feeling like she was sinking. The photograph was next. It was faded, curled at the corners, but the image was unmistakable. Michael, standing in what appeared to be a basement, this basement, facing the camera with an expression that wasn't quite fear, but wasn't peace either. His eyes were red-rimmed, his mouth closed tight. The background showed the stone wall, bare and empty, long before Robert had turned the space into a workshop. "This was taken down there," Fernando said quietly. "In your basement, before the benches, before anything was built." Patricia nodded, her voice caught somewhere deep inside her throat. Her entire body was shaking now. Why would any of this be here?" she managed. Fernando didn't answer. He didn't need to. The implication was beginning to bloom between them like a poisonous flower. These weren't just Michael's things. They were Michael's last things. And they had been buried directly beneath her father's workspace for 25 years. "We have to ask him," Patricia said. "We have to ask Robert what he knows." But even as she said it, she already knew something was wrong. Her father had always been quiet, reserved, emotionally distant, but he had never been careless, never reckless, never someone who would fail to mention a box in his own basement, unless he had a reason not to. Patricia waited until her mother was napping and asked her father to come outside. She didn't show him the photograph or the notebook first, just the watch. His face paled instantly. He took it from her hand with trembling fingers, staring at it as though he'd seen a ghost. "Where did you find this?" he asked. "In the basement," she said, watching him closely. "Right where your bench used to be, under the floor." Robert sat down without speaking, his eyes still locked on the watch. His lips moved, but made no sound. Patricia could feel something breaking. Inside him, inside her. "Dad," she said slowly, "was Michael ever in the basement? That morning?" Her father didn't answer. Not directly. He only said, in a voice so low it was barely audible, "We should have never dug there." And then he stood, walked back inside the house, and closed the door behind him. The photograph haunted Patricia that night. It sat on the kitchen table, weighed down by the silence of a house that had always known more than it said. She didn't touch it again, but she stared at it for hours, committing every grainy detail to memory. The texture of the stone wall behind Michael, the shadow near his shoulder that might have been a tool rack, or maybe just a trick of light, the way his little hands were clenched in front of him, as if trying to be brave for whoever stood behind the camera. It wasn't just a picture. It was a message from the past, from a moment captured and hidden, now uncovered like a buried scream. And the longer Patricia looked at it, the more she realized something was deeply, disturbingly wrong. Michael hadn't looked prepared. He hadn't looked safe. His shoulders were hunched slightly inward, his face unusually still, his wide brown eyes not focused on the camera, but on the person holding it. That single glance, frozen in time, was not one of trust. It was the look of a child waiting for something to happen, or maybe dreading what already had. That realization, small but unshakable, spread through Patricia like ice. She rose from the table sometime after midnight and descended the creaking stairs to the basement, barefoot, heart pounding, photo in hand. The workers had left the excavation unfinished. A shallow pit gaped near the north wall, framed by broken cement and exposed foundation. The space smelled like earth and something older, something metallic and stale. Patricia stood in the middle of the basement, holding the photo in front of her, slowly turning in place, comparing every angle, every curve of the wall behind Michael to the real stone behind her now. It matched, perfectly. She backed up until she was standing exactly where Michael had stood, the same height, the same lighting. She could almost feel the lens focusing on her from across the room, almost hear the shutter click. But who had been behind the camera? Who had taken this photograph? She hadn't asked that question directly, yet, and she already feared the answer. Patricia looked toward the southeast corner, where the concrete was slightly newer, smoother, a shade paler than the rest of the floor. She remembered Robert pouring that slab when she was 17. He'd said it was to seal off a crack that had been letting in water. No one questioned him. No one even asked. But now she did. She knelt down, placed the photograph on the ground beside her, and pressed her palm to the concrete. It was cold, not from temperature, but from something deeper, something inside it, buried. The next morning, she didn't mention the basement. Not to Carla, not to Robert, not even to Fernando, who watched her from across the breakfast table with cautious eyes. Instead, she waited. She watched. She let the silence speak. And when Robert finally came down for coffee, Patricia placed the photo on the table between them. He looked at it, then at her, then back at the photo. His face didn't change, not at first, but his hand, his left hand, the one with the arthritis, twitched once before going still again. "Where did you get that?" he asked. His voice was steady, but softer than usual, as if testing the weight of each word. "Inside the box," she replied. "In the basement, where your workbench used to be." Robert stared at the image. "I don't remember this photo." "But you remember that wall," she said quietly, "because you built the shelves in front of it, right after Michael disappeared." Robert didn't answer. "Was he ever down there that day?" she asked again. "Before school? Before he vanished?" Her father swallowed hard. His knuckles whitened around the edge of the table. "No," he said, but it was the kind of no that people say when they've rehearsed it so long they've stopped noticing it's a lie. Patricia stood, her voice trembling. "Someone took that picture. In our house. Someone who had access. Someone who knew where to hide the box. Someone who didn't want us to ever find it." Robert stood too, slowly, with the stiffness of age and guilt both. "It doesn't mean what you think." "Then what does it mean?" Patricia's voice rose just slightly. "Because either Michael was brought down there by someone, or he came on his own and never left. And either way, you were the only one here." Silence. Deafening. Carla had gone to her doctor's appointment. The house was empty but for them. Fernando had taken a phone call outside. Patricia leaned in, tears welling behind her eyes. "Tell me the truth," she whispered. "Please, don't make me find it in the ground." Robert looked at her then. Really looked, and in that moment, she saw something shift in his face. Not defiance, not denial, just fatigue. the kind that comes from carrying something far too long. "There are things you don't understand," he said, barely above a breath. "Then help me understand," she replied, "because I can't keep pretending this house isn't trying to tell us something. And I think you've known that longer than anyone." He sat back down slowly, his shoulders sagged, his eyes dropped to the photo again. "I didn't kill him," he said, "but I didn't save him either." And with that, Patricia knew the rest of the story wasn't going to come quickly or easily. But it was coming, like a storm that had waited 25 years to break. They sat in the kitchen for a long time before Robert spoke again, the photograph between them like a crack in the table, a quiet, damning witness to everything that hadn't been said for 25 years. Outside, wind stirred the branches of the oak in the backyard, and somewhere down the block, a dog barked and was silenced. But in that kitchen, time didn't move. Patricia sat perfectly still, hands in her lap, waiting. Robert stared at the floor, elbows on his knees, his breathing shallow. When he finally spoke, his voice didn't sound like hers, or like his. It sounded like a man scraping something out from the very bottom of his soul. "He came home that morning," Robert said. "October 15th, around 9:30. I was home too. I didn't go to work that day. I'd called in sick because I had the flu, or maybe I said I had it. I wasn't feeling right. But really, I was just tired. Everything had been going wrong for weeks. I'd lost a big client at the garage. The bills were piling up. Your mother had been asking about money we didn't have. I was angry all the time. Quiet angry. The kind that boils under the skin." Patricia said nothing. She barely breathed. Robert swallowed hard and went on. "When he came in the door, I thought he'd forgotten something. His backpack was on, but he looked scared, like a balloon that was about to pop. I asked him what he was doing back so soon, and he just stood there, fidgeting. Then he said he had left school because the kids were teasing him, about his science project, the frog. He was crying. I told him to go back to class, that I didn't have time for this. I was in the basement, fixing an old microwave someone had dropped off. He followed me down. Kept crying. I snapped. His voice cracked for the first time. Patricia watched his eyes begin to well, and she knew this wasn't rehearsed. This wasn't a lie. This was the part of the story that had lived inside him like a parasite. "I didn't hit him," Robert said quickly, as if trying to make that detail clear. "I didn't mean to hurt him. I just grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the stairs. Said I was going to take him back to school myself. But..." He resisted. He tried to twist out of my grip, and I pulled harder. He tripped over a toolbox, fell forward, hit his head on the corner of the bench. I thought it was nothing, just a bump. But then, he didn't get up. So Patricia's hands clenched into fists without realizing. Her father's voice was shaking now, his eyes wet. I checked for breathing. I shook him. I screamed his name. There was blood, not much, but enough. I called 911. They said help was on the way. But while I was waiting, He stopped, looked up at her, then away again. I panicked. I saw the blood. I saw him lying there. And all I could think was, they're going to say I did this on purpose, that I killed my own son. I thought about you, about James, about your mother. I thought if I went to prison, you'd all lose everything. So when the sirens got closer, He wiped his face with his sleeve, trembling. I wrapped him in a blanket, the blue one from his bed. I carried him down to the far corner, dug with my hands at first, then with a crowbar. The dirt was soft. I had 30 minutes. I poured a layer of cement over it after they left. Told them Michael had left for school and never come home. Said I didn't know anything. The silence that followed was a sound all its own. Thick, alive, vibrating behind Patricia's eyes. She felt the walls breathing with her, the old wallpaper absorbing the weight of the truth. "The box?" she asked after a long moment. Robert nodded. Afterward, I couldn't throw away his things, but I couldn't keep them in plain sight either. So I packed them up. The jacket, the shoes, his notebook. I added the watch last, wrapped it all and buried it under the bench where I thought no one would ever dig. Then I built the workbench over it. I've been sitting on top of it every day since. Patricia's mouth was dry. Her heart was pounding in her chest like a fist against a locked door. "Why didn't you tell us?" she whispered. "All these years, all this pain." "Why?" Robert's eyes were red now. His voice cracked again. "Because once I started lying, I couldn't stop. I told myself it was to protect the family, but it was really just to protect myself. I couldn't face what I did. Not just the accident, but the betrayal. I let your mother suffer. I let you carry guilt. I let the world believe something that wasn't true because I was too much of a coward to tell them otherwise. Patricia stood. She couldn't sit anymore. The ground felt unstable beneath her, like the whole house had shifted. She walked to the window, looked out over the backyard, where the box still sat beneath a tarp. "We have to call the police," she said. "We have to bring him home, the right way." Robert didn't argue. He only nodded, shoulders collapsing inward. "Will they arrest me?" "Probably," she said. "Will I go to prison?" "Maybe, but you've already been living in one." Her voice was steel now. "And so have we." He looked up at her with eyes filled not just with sorrow, but relief. As if the truth, horrible as it was, had finally released its grip. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I know," she said, "but sorry doesn't bring him back." And then she walked toward the stairs, because there was still one more thing she had to do, one more place she needed to stand, one more promise she had to keep. She stood at the edge of the basement, barefoot on cold cement, eyes fixed on the southeast corner where the concrete changed color ever so slightly. A subtle difference that most people would miss, but that Patricia could no longer unsee. It was smoother, cleaner, poured with more care, as if it was meant not to support weight, but to bury something beneath it permanently. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the flashlight, its beam flickering across the uneven surface, picking up the faint outline of where the new concrete had been laid over the old. She remembered it now. She had been 17. Her father had said there was a leak. That moisture was seeping in and ruining his tools. She hadn't questioned it. No one had. But now the truth pressed against her skin like a fever. She lowered herself to the ground and sat cross-legged on the floor directly above where Robert said he had buried Michael. The weight of that knowledge, of standing, sitting, exactly above her little brother's final resting place, settled in her chest like a stone she couldn't cough out. The concrete had silenced his voice for 25 years, had allowed his absence to masquerade as mystery, as tragedy without origin. But it had always been here, right under their feet. Fernando came down the stairs quietly behind her, the tension in his steps betraying his effort to stay calm. He stopped a few feet away. "Did he tell you everything?" he asked gently. Patricia nodded. "He did." She didn't turn to face him. It wasn't murder, it was rage, followed by fear, followed by cowardice. Fernando didn't speak. He knew better than to fill this moment with words. "We're calling the police," she said after a moment. "Tomorrow morning. But tonight, I just want to sit with him." Fernando came closer, knelt beside her, and gently took her hand. "Okay," he said. "We'll sit." They sat like that for hours. Carla never came down. She had gone to bed early, her energy drained from the doctor's visit. Robert remained upstairs in the den, alone, the light under the door glowing like a warning. Patricia didn't go to him. She didn't have to. The truth had already taken root in the walls, in the floor, in every nail and joint and crack of that house. There was nothing more to say. At 8:47 p.m., the same time frozen on Michael's Mickey Mouse watch, Patricia placed the photo of him on the floor above where he lay. "You didn't deserve this," she whispered. "I should have walked with you that morning. I should have waited. I'm so sorry, Mikey." Her voice broke. Fernando wrapped an arm around her shoulder, but said nothing. She leaned into him, not for comfort, but for grounding, for proof she was still here, still breathing, still capable of standing in this truth and not letting it destroy her. The next morning, Detective Samuel Price stood at the door, 25 years older but instantly recognizable. His silver hair was combed back neatly, his badge clipped to a belt now worn with time. When Patricia opened the door, he looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to place her in time, to match the woman in front of him with the girl who once wept silently in his interview room. "You have something to tell me?" he asked. "Yes," she said, her voice flat, strong. "We found Michael." She led him downstairs. The excavation team arrived within the hour. The room was cleared. A forensics unit set up lights and documentation equipment. Plastic sheets lined the floors. Patricia, Fernando, and Detective Price stood back as two workers in hazmat suits drilled into the concrete, their tools roaring like thunder in the confined space. Every vibration traveled up through Patricia's legs and into her chest. It felt like the earth was breaking open, like the truth itself was being excavated. When the concrete finally gave way, the diggers moved more delicately. They switched to hand tools, trowels, brushes. Patricia's breath caught in her throat when one of them paused, looked up, and nodded. Something had been found. Layers of dirt were removed inch by inch. And then, fabric. A blue blanket. Patricia recognized it instantly. Michael's. The one Carla had knitted when she was pregnant with him. The one with the tiny white stitched frogs in each corner. Then came the outline of a small form. Delicately wrapped, arms tucked, a crucifix placed in the folds near the chest, and beside him, a family photo. One Patricia had never known was missing. It showed the 5 of them. Michael grinning with cake on his chin. Carla's arm around Robert. James holding Patricia's hand. It had once sat on the living room bookshelf. Now it was here, a gesture of remorse, or love, or maybe both. Patricia stepped forward, tears rolling silently down her cheeks. "You kept him close," she whispered, "but you still left him alone." The coroner documented everything. The remains were removed with reverence. Carla insisted on being there when they carried Michael out. She didn't cry. She just pressed her hand to his blanket-wrapped form and said, "My baby." Robert didn't speak. His hands were cuffed gently, and Detective Price read him his rights with a voice heavy from the weight of years. "Do you understand these rights as I've explained them to you?" Robert nodded. "Yes," he said, "and I accept them." Patricia watched from the porch as the car pulled away, and in that moment she realized something unexpected. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning. Not of justice, though that would come, but of peace. Of finally being able to breathe in a house that had held its breath for a quarter of a century. She walked back inside, into Michael's room, sat on his bed, and let herself cry. Not for the loss, but for the release. The trial of Robert Herrera began in early September 2012, nearly 6 months after the discovery in the basement, and 25 years, almost to the day, since Michael's disappearance had first made headlines. The courtroom was small, outdated, with creaky benches and fluorescent lights that flickered just enough to feel like time itself was stalling. But for Patricia, sitting behind the prosecution's table each day, it was the most brutally honest place she had ever been. Everything was laid bare. Michael's age, the timeline of that October morning, the forensic confirmation of the cause of death. Blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with a fall. The court heard about the cement poured over a grave, the box of belongings buried under a workbench, the lies, the silence, and finally, the confession. Robert Herrera pled guilty to involuntary manslaughter and obstruction of justice. He stood before the judge with his hands folded, his voice barely rising above a whisper as he said the words, "I take full responsibility. I failed my son. I failed my family. I am not asking for forgiveness. I am only asking for truth." Carla was not in the courtroom the day he was sentenced. Her health had declined rapidly since the truth came out, her body reacting to the years of compressed trauma with a slow, quiet collapse. She watched the hearing from her hospital bed, holding Patricia's hand via a live video stream. When the sentence came, 8 years in prison with eligibility for parole in 5, Carla didn't flinch. She only whispered, "That's fair. It's not enough. But it's fair." James flew in from Eugene the following weekend. When Patricia told him everything, every detail, every lie, every buried truth, he didn't speak for a long time. Then, as they sat together on the porch of the now empty house, he finally said, "I spent years blaming myself, thinking I should have been there, that it was my fault. But it wasn't any of us, was it?" "No," Patricia replied, "it wasn't." The funeral was held at Greenwood Memorial Park on October 15th, 2012, exactly 25 years after the day Michael vanished. It wasn't a large ceremony, but it was full of neighbors who remembered him as the boy who loved frogs, teachers who had taught him multiplication tables and watched him draw planets in the margins of his tests, detectives who had searched until the case went cold, journalists who had followed the story for decades. James's children, Michael and Angel, stood near the casket holding white lilies. Carla was wheeled to the front, her eyes dry, her voice silent, but her presence radiant with something that looked, if not like peace, then like acceptance. Fernando stood beside Patricia, his hand in hers, as the final words were spoken, and the small white casket, finally, after all these years, was lowered into the earth not beneath concrete, but beneath sky. "Rest," Patricia whispered, placing a photo of Michael at age 8 beside a toy frog they had found tucked in the attic. "This time, no one is hiding you." She stayed behind after everyone left, sitting alone on the cool grass, her knees drawn to her chest, just listening. To the wind, to the leaves, to the quiet that, for once, didn't feel like absence, but completion. Later that month, the house on Lambert Street was put up for sale. Patricia and Fernando moved into a home closer to James's family, where Carla could receive better care and where laughter wasn't a stranger. They didn't take much from the old house, just a few photos, Michael's notebook, and the Mickey Mouse watch, now cleaned and resting in a shadow box near the window. Robert wrote letters from prison. Not often, but always addressed to Michael. He never asked for forgiveness, only recounted memories. How Michael once tried to teach the family dog to sit using leftover chicken nuggets. How he'd insisted that frogs were just misunderstood dinosaurs. How he always asked questions no one had answers to. Patricia read them all. She never responded, but she didn't throw them away either, because they weren't letters to her. They belonged to someone else. To a boy finally at rest. To a father who would spend the rest of his life beneath the weight of a moment he could never undo. In December, Patricia launched the Michael Foundation, dedicated to helping families of missing children navigate the impossible terrain between hope and grief. Their first outreach program offered legal assistance for families who suspected someone close but had no voice to speak it. Their tagline was simple: "The truth doesn't destroy, the silence does." On the first anniversary of the funeral, they returned to Greenwood. James brought his children. Carla, though frailer than ever, insisted on coming. They brought flowers, drawings, a small science kit. Patricia brought the frog sketch from Michael's old notebook, now laminated and framed. "He would have been 35 this year," James whispered. "He might have been a teacher, a biologist, or just a dad." Patricia smiled sadly. "He was all of that to us, even for 8 years. The sun set quietly that evening. No dramatics, no thunder, just golden light over grass and stone. And in that soft silence, they said goodbye again. Not because they had forgotten, but because they had finally remembered everything. The truth, the love, the cost, and the weight of goodbye that had waited a quarter century to be spoken out loud. Prison didn't change Robert Herrera in the way people thought it might. It didn't break him or punish him in ways visible to the outside world. But what it did was far more permanent. It stripped him of language. From the day he entered the correctional facility in eastern Oregon, Robert withdrew deeper into himself, retreating behind a wall of silence so complete that even his cellmate, a former school teacher who tried to engage him with chess and small talk, gave up after a week. The guards nicknamed him the Mechanic because he spent most of his time in the workshop, fixing broken radios and coffee makers from the staff break room. He rarely spoke unless it was required. He never raised his voice. He never explained himself. Not to the counselor, not to the chaplain, not to the parole officer, who reminded him he might be eligible for early release in 5 years. "You've got to talk, Mr. Herrera," the officer said once. "Participation matters. Remorse matters." Robert only nodded. But remorse had already consumed him from the inside. He didn't need to perform it. He had lived with it every day for 25 years, breathing it, sitting on top of it, watching it stare back at him through the eyes of his daughter. Patricia wrote him 3 letters during the first year of his incarceration. Each one short, each one careful. She didn't ask him how he was. She didn't tell him about her life. She simply wrote what needed to be said. In the first, she told him Michael had been buried properly with a headstone and that Carla visited every Sunday. In the second, she told him about the Michael Foundation, that his grandson now knew who he was named after. In the third, she wrote only a sentence. "You were right, Dad. Truth is the only thing heavier than silence." He never responded, not once. Carla, after long consideration, made the decision to visit him in the second year. She walked into the prison's visitation room with the slow dignity of someone who had survived something others couldn't even name. When Robert appeared, thinner, grayer, but unmistakably still the man she had once loved, she looked into his face for a long time before saying anything. "I came because I needed to see your eyes when I said goodbye," she told him. "Not because I forgive you, not because I hate you, but because I want peace for myself." Robert blinked once, tears quietly spilling over his lower lashes. He didn't speak. He simply nodded. Carla stood, placed a photo of Michael on the table, and whispered, "You loved him. I know that, but you let your fear swallow him." And then she left. She never returned. She never needed to. Robert spent the next 3 years in complete silence. He didn't attend chapel. He didn't sign up for family calls. He continued to fix machines for staff and inmates alike, his hands stained with oil and dust, his eyes distant. He grew frail, his back bent, but he never once raised his voice. Not even when he was informed that Carla had passed away in her sleep at age 69. Not when Patricia sent a letter saying they'd held a small memorial near Michael's grave. Not even when the warden himself delivered the news. Instead, Robert walked back to his cell, sat on the lower bunk, and stayed awake all night, turning a small screwdriver over and over in his fingers like it might somehow rewind time. When his parole hearing came at year 4, he declined to participate. "You're aware this could reduce your sentence?" the public defender asked. Robert only looked out the window at a single branch swaying in the courtyard wind and said, "There are some sentences that don't belong to courts." The warden noted in his file that the inmate was no threat to others, showed no signs of aggression, but had exhibited long-term voluntary verbal abstinence, which they couldn't officially classify as psychological resistance, because Robert passed every test. His mind was sharp, but his voice had been buried along with his son. By the time he was released on parole, 5.5 years after entering, he was 71 and in poor health. He returned not to Lambert Street, it had long been sold, but to a small assisted living home just outside Salem, Oregon, where he was registered under partial house arrest and subject to monthly check-ins. Patricia visited him once, just once. Not for reconciliation, but for closure. He was thinner than she remembered, smaller, like a man carved from ash. When she entered the room, he looked up at her with wide, waiting eyes. She sat beside him and placed her hand gently on the table between them. "I've said everything I needed to say," she told him. "But I wanted to see you once more, because despite everything, you're still my father, and Michael's too." His lips trembled, his fingers twitched, but no words came, and Patricia realized, in that moment, that silence had become the only language he had left. She stood slowly, placed a copy of Michael's science sketch, laminated and faded, into his hands, and whispered, "Goodbye." Robert never spoke again, not to staff, not to neighbors, not to the hospice nurse who held his hand in the final days of his life. He died quietly in his sleep in the spring of 2019, 7 years after the truth came to light, with the drawing still tucked in the drawer beside his bed. No funeral was held. No obituary was printed. But Patricia and James gathered one morning in April beneath a sycamore tree near Greenwood Memorial Park and said a few words over a small wooden box of ashes. "He couldn't undo what he did," Patricia said, "but he carried it until the very end. That counts for something." James nodded. "It counts for everything we never got to say." And for the first time in a very long time, there were no lies, no hiding, just silence, and what remained after it had finally spoken. Years passed, as they always do, but the name Michael Herrera never faded from the hearts of those who knew the truth. In Portland, the old Lambert Street house was purchased by a young couple who turned the basement into a creative studio, never knowing that the concrete they dug out had once hidden something unspoken. But Patricia knew. She would sometimes pass the street during her drives, slowing near the corner where the maple tree still stood, tall and quiet like a sentinel of memory. She never stopped. She never knocked. She had learned by then that peace didn't always mean returning to the place where the pain began. It meant learning how to carry it differently. The Michael Foundation grew in reach and in heart. What began as a single outreach project slowly expanded into a national support system. They partnered with forensic anthropologists, child psychologists, legal advocates, and cold case detectives. They provided families with the tools to ask the questions no one else dared to. By 2020, the Foundation had assisted in resolving 7 long-term missing children cases, all of which had been dismissed at some point by police due to lack of evidence. But more than the numbers, it was the conversations that mattered. Mothers who were finally believed, siblings who no longer blamed themselves, children who now had their names spoken in rooms that had once gone silent. Patricia never sought recognition. When a journalist from The Atlantic asked to do a feature piece titled "The Sister Who Dug Up the Past," she politely declined. "This was never about me," she said. "It was about a boy who asked where frogs go in winter and never got to find out." In her office at the Foundation's new headquarters, a renovated schoolhouse in downtown Portland, she kept only a few things on her desk. Michael's frog sketch, now framed behind glass, a photo of him holding a sparkler on his 8th birthday, and a folded letter from her mother, written in her final weeks, in which Carla had scribbled, "I see him every time I see you speak truth." Fernando remained by Patricia's side, not as a husband, they had never married, but as a lifelong partner in both purpose and peace. Their bond was forged in the dark and polished in the light. He taught science at a local high school and often used Michael's story, with Patricia's permission, as a lesson in empathy and ethics. "Sometimes the hardest truths," he told his students, "are buried not because people are evil, but because they're afraid. We must always be brave enough to listen." James, too, found his way back to the world. He moved to Seattle with his children and opened a bookstore named Mikey's Corner, where he hosted community readings for kids every Saturday. When asked once why he named it after a child many had never heard of, he smiled and said, "Because he was real, and he mattered. And stories are how we keep people alive." In 2025, on what would have been Michael's 41st birthday, the city of Portland dedicated a public garden near Mount Tabor Park in his memory. The Michael A. Herrera Children's Grove featured native plants, a reading bench shaped like a frog, and a small bronze plaque that read, "For every voice that went unheard, for every child who never made it home, may this be a place where their names are safe." At the opening ceremony, Patricia spoke softly into the microphone, surrounded by families, volunteers, and children holding paper frogs. "When I was a girl," she said, "I thought silence was strength, that if we didn't talk about pain, it would go away. But the truth is, it doesn't. Silence grows teeth. It devours the things we love, and sometimes it buries a child beneath our own floor. But if we're brave enough to break that silence, even after decades, we find something unexpected. Not just sorrow, but love that never died. This garden isn't just for Michael. It's for all the voices we still haven't heard." That night, Patricia walked through the grove alone. The sun was setting in warm streaks of orange and lavender across the trees. The wind rustled the leaves gently, as if whispering back to her. She stopped at the bench, sat down, and pulled out a small notebook. Inside were letters she had written to Michael over the years. Some were angry. Some were tender. Some simply asked questions. Tonight she wrote one more. "Dear Mikey, I used to wonder what you'd be like now. If you'd be taller than James, if you'd still love frogs, if you'd have kids of your own. But now I realize you never really left. You just changed shape. You're in every family we've helped, every child we've named, every truth we've spoken out loud. Thank you for teaching us that even silence has an ending. Love always, Patty." She folded the note, tucked it into the hollow under the bench, and sat for a while longer, watching as two children chased each other across the grass, their laughter unburdened, free. And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she was missing anything. She felt whole, not because the past had been erased, but because it had been seen, named, remembered. Michael Herrera had lived 8 short years, but his story would echo far longer. Not in headlines, not in courtrooms, but in gardens, in classrooms, in the soft moments where truth replaced fear. And in that quiet echo, there was something rare, something strong, something like peace. Some stories don't end with justice. They end with silence breaking, with secrets unearthed not by detectives or DNA, but by love that refused to forget. Michael Herrera's life was short, but his echo reached far, into courtrooms, classrooms, gardens, and hearts. His sister didn't just find a truth buried beneath concrete. She found purpose, voice, and legacy. And in a world where so many children still go missing, maybe the most powerful thing we can do is remember. Speak their names, ask the hard questions, refuse to let silence win. Because sometimes, closure isn't about punishment. It's about light finally touching what was hidden in the dark for too long. If this story moved you, share it. Not just for Michael, but for the voices still waiting to be heard.